So we know now how to physically interconnect devices that have RS485 capability, but our job is not done. We need to do something else to ensure that the RS485 network operates properly. This is what this lecture is about. Now, every RS485 port on a device has configuration parameters associated with it, and these configuration parameters must be set using the programming software for the particular device. Just as how we needed to configure the Modbus unit ID of every device using programming software, we need to do the same for the RS485 ports of every device. Now, regardless of the manufacturer or model, RS485 ports have the same four configuration parameters. They are baud rate, number of data bits, number of stop bits, and parity. Before we go into what each of these parameters do, I want to make the most important point of this lecture right now, and it's this. Every single device on the same RS485 network must all have the exact same settings for the port parameters. It is the only way that the RS485 network will operate properly. It's not so important as to what settings you choose. What's more important on the RS485 network is that every single device have the same settings. So let's have a look, an individual look at those parameters we just mentioned. The first one is baud rate. Baud rate really implies, or what stands for, is bits per second. I'm using an internet connection right now that's a 5 meg connection. That's 5 megabytes per second, right? So that's 5 megabytes, a byte is 8 bits, right? 5 by 8, etc., etc. But the RS485 networks, like all these serial networks, use much lower bit per second rates. So this is the rate at which the devices will exchange data, bits per second, right? How many bits per second on the line? Baud rates, the settings will look something like this: 1200 bits per second, 2400, 4800, 9600, 19,200 bits per second. A very popular one that's used is 9600 bits per second. It's a typical rate. In fact, most devices will default to this particular baud rate, right? So baud rate is the rate at which data is transferred on the RS485 network. If devices on the network have different baud rates, they can't communicate with one another. If you're using 9600 bits per second, use it all through on every device. Number of data bits. Remember that the point of the data network is to transfer messages, request and respond messages, as in the case of Modbus. So you have to actually send data across, and data is actually sent in frames. And the settings for this is either 7 or 8. So this indicates how many bits at a time make up a frame. So you can choose either 7 bits to make up a data frame or 8 bits to make up a data frame. And all of that is handled internally by the actual RS485 communications port. Number of stop bits. Well, each RS485 port, when it receives data, must know when the data has ended, when the frame is stopped. And it uses either 1 or 2 stop bits, and you must specify this. Parity. Parity is not much used again, but is still included in the RS485 port parameters. And parity is a sort of error checking that you would use. There are 3 choices for this: none, odd, and even. Usually none is sufficient, no error checking, because the protocol that would be used over RS485 would have its own error checking. So parity is really from the old days when RS485 was first developed. But still, you can use odd or even. Just make sure that every device on the network uses the same sort of parity check. They must match once again. So that's what those parameters look like, and those are the choices you have for those various configuration parameters. So if we take the RS485 network in the previous example, all 4 of these devices should have the same settings for their port configuration parameters. For example, I could set all of the parameters of all of the RS485 ports to this. baud rate 9600 bits per second, number of data bits 8, number of stop bits 1, parity none. In fact, this is a typical configuration parameter list and settings that you would find in devices. Most devices default to these settings on their port, and it works very, very well. The main thing from this lecture is that you understand these 4 configuration parameters, understand what they mean, but much more importantly, understand the fact that whatever settings you use for the RS485 network, those same port settings must be on every single device. They must match, they must be identical, otherwise there will be no communication on the network. Great.